We are back on the 49 wheelies. We told you guys that we were going to be shooting a lot of this because of our timeline. In the last video, we showed you guys how we fixed all the cancer replacement and rust repair. And today's video, we're going to be dialing in the door gap. When you're dialing in the door gaps, there's a few things you want to really consider, and that is, do you have the weight accounted for in the door for the window, the regulator, all the hardware? Because if we spend the time to make all these gaps perfect and then you get to the end of the road and you didn't account for those things, the door will have door sag, and you'll be combating that the whole time and not understanding why your gaps just don't fit like they did in the beginning. We're going to be checking everything with a 3/16 gauge. This is a big kid block gauge. They work good for just giving you a visual. You can use 3/16 brake line is what I used to use. And it's just so that way you can sight this in and move it around to see what kind of gap. But we don't want to just jump right into grinding the door. There's some things that we also want to consider besides just the weight. We have these deep beads that are done into the back of the extra cab and the door. Those need to be aligned correctly with a straight edge and or laser. And then you need to also be considering for this particular project, if you have these beads, we don't want to have this reveal where we have, call it a 2-inch reveal that's flat to the bead, showing wider and narrower and all that stuff. So what we want to do is be able to move the gap where it makes the most sense. It's a lot more work if we're cutting the extra cab and having to move the panel in or out on the edge of the door jamb versus cutting the door. But the caveat there is this is a factory door. The thing you have to remember is that they never ever fit what we're achieving today back then. We took a measurement along the door from the edge to the bead and then down here, and this edge is actually inconsistent to begin with, so I'm not as concerned about shaving or modifying this door. But what I am concerned with is making sure that these reveals are uniform. And in this case, because of the timeline, we don't have the time to cut a panel and move a panel if we need to. But what we can do is if one area is narrower or longer, we can always add lead into this area to make the bead move ever so slightly. We're not talking about a ton, but we are talking about laying out this basically X and Y axis to make sure all of these things track correctly. Also, things to consider, having your panels aligned flush, because if they're not flush, well then that's going to open your gap and make your reveal bigger or smaller. In this case, we have a 3/16 gap that's actually wide at the top, and as we come down right below the door handle, it gets tight and then to the point where it completely touches. So what we're going to do is we are going to be using a die grinder. What I have is I have the small backing plate with a 3-inch roll lock. That way I only have the thickness that I need to consider here by removing the door edge. I can stick that little tiny bit in there and I'm not fighting the rubber of the backing plate against the cab. We're going to open this up a little bit ever so slightly, and I am just going to bring this down and shave away and make marks. Where we have it where it's wide, I'm going to make some reference marks with a Sharpie and just write how much is it need to be added to the door. And when we actually go to weld this gap back up and talk about the inner flange, we'll show you guys how we extend the door as well. And I know what you guys are thinking, don't panel gap a car on a rotisserie. Yes, we're on a rotisserie, but we also have a chromoly chassis that is not flexing at all whatsoever. This is a full race truck spec, so we don't have to worry about the flex. You want to be doing your panel gaps for your project on the ground, sitting on its weight. That way the car has that flex in it. If you gapped your car on a rotisserie with just a standard body and then you put it on the ground, you would end up having a tighter gap at the top and wider at the bottom, especially with a convertible. If you're doing all of these things on a convertible, you're definitely going to want to put a few braces in with the car sitting, so that way things aren't moving around. But for this particular project, I just want to give you guys a very good visual of what are the steps needed to correct your gaps. Maybe you guys don't have all of these beads and things to think about, but maybe you have just a body line or a curvature of a door. It's essential that you get the door aligned however that needs to be to make sure that your body line on the door is lined up and exactly where it needs to be. The other thing that you really need to consider is if your car has a molding that you plan on running and you're not getting rid of it, does the molding still fit on the door? Do we have to modify some of the trim because maybe you're making it longer or shorter, and does it clear when you open and shut the door? These are all things to consider before you just jump to cutting, grinding your door, and then finding out that you actually shot yourself in the foot and you have to go backwards. At this point, we've used a 36 grit on the row lock. This is just roughing it in. I wouldn't worry too much about finessing this perfect because we're going to be adding and removing on this entire edge here in just a bit. But what we do want that's critical is we want that 3/16 gap to fit nice and perfect. I almost like it just a hair loose, because we want to make sure that we're penetrating into the door when we go to weld it, and I don't want to have to regrind and then it split again. So we're going to pull this door off, take you guys over the bench, and we're going to weld all this edge up. The number one thing you're going to see when you grind a door down is that it splits the edge where the door is flanged over. When you take that door skin from the factory, they basically hammer and dolly it around the actual frame of the door, and when you remove it, you end up splitting those, because what we have is we have three pieces here. We have the inner structure, the over flanged inner piece, and you have the outer skin. And we're going to be TIG welding this for this video. Can you MIG weld it? Yes. It's going to be a little bit more finicky, and the reason that is because you're putting a lot bulkier, harder of a weld on the edge of the door. For years we used to use the MIG, and now that we're using the TIG welder, it makes it a lot easier because the weld itself is softer and we can smash that back flat and correct some of the shrinks. So some of the things that are going to happen here is when you weld this, what happens when it welds? A weld shrinks. And if you're shrinking the edge, you get what I call turtle shelling, and the door that was either flat or round will continue to either go more round or the door won't be flat. It'll suck in the edge and put a curvature in it. But you don't want to freak out. All you have to know is that we got it to fit on the truck. We ground that gap to 3/16. We don't really care so much about this splitting because I'm picky and I want to make sure that when you open the door, it looks as if we did not modify it. In order to do that, you're going to have this little reveal here, call it a 1/2 inch to 3/8. And because we ground it, if you open the door, you're going to see one that is factory over here. And we're going to lengthen this, but it's so minimal, you probably won't even notice the upper area is even changed. But down here, we took almost 3/16 off the door, and then now this becomes thin. So what we did was we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to remove it completely. We took the measurement of what this flange is and we scribed it onto a brand new piece of sheet metal, 18 gauge. And then now we have the ability to remove what was short looking and place it in. One, we won't have the contaminated rust edge because we're going to be using a strip disc on the die grinder here in a second, and we're going to clean up all the rust in between the two. We're going to clean up the outside because TIG welding loves to be clean, and then we're going to clamp this in place. It's crucial that you ground the door exactly to where you need it, because when we actually weld this, doesn't matter if you're TIG welding or MIG welding, we want enough penetration into the door and with just enough build that we have minimal grinding when we go back to the truck. Because what we're going to do is clamp this in place. We're going to tack this every 1/2 inch all the way down the door, so that way things don't start opening up and moving. We don't want our reveal of the edge when you open the door to become wide. That's another one thing that I always see at the shows is you look at a door edge and a lot of times they're way wider than what it was in the raw. So we're going to make sure that when we weld it, we hammer and dolly the warpage back out flat. That's how you eliminate that turtle shelling, and we'll get into that at the end. We just want to show you guys some of the things you can do if you want to be this picky to get your inside edge to look factory. When we're sighting in the side of a door profile, we want that to look completely uniform. And in order to do that, you do not want the heat to start making the metal shrink and move as you go down the line. So we clamp it from one end to the other, and then we also clamp it every 1/2 inch as we tack weld down the line to make sure that we don't have any areas that end up wider and moving than others. We want it to look completely consistent as if the door was not modified. We started welding from one end all the way through to the other, and some of the things that you want to think about or consider is the thickness of the door per thousandths of an inch is going to be correlated with your amperage, and then the torch angle, because we're doing this straight up and down, you want the tungsten directed in line with the door flange and as close as possible without dipping the tungsten in, and doing one continuous weld with the same pedal all the way through. Whether you're continuous welding or whether you're fluctuating, doesn't really matter, whatever works for you guys. The whole goal is consistent heat in, is consistent heat out. What do I mean by that? If we can do a consistent heat zone that you see alongside the door, that's a consistent stretch that we're going to do with the hammer and dolly down the weld seam itself. But keeping it in line will help you from blowing away the edge of the door. If you have this thing kicked to a side, it's going to focus more on that side. That's beneficial because if you're ever welding something that's thinner to something that's thicker, you can angle the tungsten in your favor to put the puddle where you need it. If you're MIG welding your door edge, you are going to want to do the same thing we did with the TIG, where you tack weld every 1/2 inch, moving the clamp down the panel. And then once everything is locked in and it's not going to move on you, then you can start stacking the weld. So if you have a weld here, you are going to be concentrating the wire, stacking the weld on each one of those tacks, and you are then going to start connecting those areas that are spot weld. So if this is a 1/2 inch, you're stacking it here, and then move over and then stack that one, and just try to keep your heat even through. So start on one end and tack and move over. Maybe you move 3 tacks at a time, whatever works for you, and then you place that tack stacking one on top of another. The only downside to MIG welding, well, not the only downside, but one of the big one is that you're going to have a lot more grinding to do because it's a lot more bulky of a weld, where we might have 5 minutes in facing both sides of the door, and you might have a lot more grinding to do after you get done MIG welding that. But just keep it down. If you do get too much heat, you can use air and cool it with your blowgun on the air nozzle, and just try to keep things concentrated and even through the process. After we've completed our welding and we've faced each side, I'm not focusing on the gap itself height-wise on this door right now, because we're going to do that on the truck in a minute. But what I want to stress is that once you have faced the welds on either side, what happens when you weld is it is shrinking. So it's pulling the material in on that area, and you have to stretch it back out. So if we go back to the pizza dough analogy, and you got a ball of dough, that is your weld, and you need to smash the weld itself and stretch it back out. What that's going to do is it's going to relax the edge of the door back out flat. When we welded it, you could see with the ruler that the door had started pulling in, and that's where we get a lot of that turtle shelling that I like to call. And the reason that that's important in my eyes is because if you don't stretch that back out, and I don't mean taking the hammer and hitting the edge, at that point you're just bending the flange. You're not actually stretching the weld back out. You need to use it with a dolly and actually smash the weld to get it to come back out and relax. And when you do that, you can use the straight edge to verify before you even go back to the door. You can see the amount of warpage that you have on the side profile before, and then you can see it after you work it out. Well, what are the different challenges you're going to have with hammer and dollying? One, TIG welding. If we do even heat in, even heat out, you can see I was able to work this door very evenly. I am focusing on the distance of my hammer strikes being even and consistent. The pressure, I'm locking my arm and I'm hitting it the same every time as I work it down, because even heat in is even heat out. We're working out the warpage. Now, it's a little bit more problematic when you have a MIG welder because you've done different amounts of heat. Maybe the MIG welder blew a bigger hole. Maybe you don't have as much control. So if you have more heat and less heat in different areas, well, that's going to require a different amount of hammer and dolly work. For example, where I had the new flange put in on the backside, where the two connected, I had to give it a couple more tacks than the rest of the door, and that was more heat, more shrink. So I had to do more hammer and dolly work right in that area. As I moved the ruler down side to side, I could see where the areas were still low. So if you're MIG welding or you have inconsistent heat, whatever welding you're doing, you can at least use the ruler to see where those areas are low, and then you can go and hammer and dolly those areas until they're back flush to go back to the car. We're going to take this door back over to the truck, bolt it back up exactly where we had it before, and then we are going to show you how we get our gap back nice and consistent. All right, we got door back on. We took the 3-inch with the die grinder. This time we are trying to get this thing back as close as we can and nice and tight and consistent. I switched to 80 grit on the roll lock because I don't want to take too much too fast, instead of in the beginning when we were roughing it in with 36 grit. But what we do is we just start, massage a small area, work slowly, take your gap tool and check it as you go. Where it stops, just continue to work it until you get a nice consistent gap. This gap tool is actually designed to have a longer edge on it that rides against one side or the other, so it could scribe. But the problem with this tool is it's not hardened steel and it does wear out on the edges. So a lot of times you're just gonna go right back to grind it, check it, grind it, check it. When they're brand new, they work awesome because you can paint Dykem or a guide coat on the edge and scribe it, and then you just open the door, grind it real fast right to the scribe line, and you're done. The only thing we're gonna do after this is I have a couple little tiny areas up top where I just have to add a little bit more. So we'll take this tool and we'll mark out, add from point A to point B, and we'll do this exact same process again until this is perfect. At the end, I'll take an orbital sander with 80 grit and I will just round out that edge so it looks factory and not square. If you guys haven't liked and subscribed, please do. When we get into the body filler side of this, we're gonna show you how we make this gap look exactly perfect, consistent round edge, consistent perfect gap. Yes, this is consistent, but how do you make it exactly perfect? If you guys have tips, tricks, things that you use, please drop a comment below, and I hope this video helped you guys. We'll see you on the next one.